everyone, and welcome to the webinar today, Shifting Focus from Documentation to Data. Will be presented by Rick Minio, who will introduce himself in a second. The next slide is just looking at our privacy disclaimer, so nothing new here, just always have that on our webinars. And then Rick, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Madison. Thank you everyone for joining today. Before I dive in, this is the main topic. I want to talk about some data about Kneat and myself. Kneat is a publicly traded company on the Canadian Stock Exchange, over 200 employees at this time and growing. We are in 8 of the top 10 biopharma, 60 plus customers overall, 40,000 end users or users, and 150 sites across the globe. And we are located in Switzerland, US, Canada, and in Ireland. And we do all of our in-house development, and we're ISO 9000 and 27001 certified. Okay, and now a little bit about myself. I've been working in the biopharma industry for just under 3 decades. I'm a licensed professional engineer in North Carolina with a Master's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Clemson University. I started my journey in validation in 1994, and since then I've worked for many large multinational companies as well as small startup companies in the United States and Europe. I'm currently Director of Strategic Partnerships at Kneat, and I've been working with Kneat Gx application for just over 9 years now. I led the selection and implementation team that deployed and scaled the Kneat application globally at Biogen, and during my 3.5-ish years of tenure at Kneat, I've developed and launched Kneat Academy, our software training program, as well as Kneat Partner Program. The digitization of paper-based work processes aligns with my passion for developing and improving work processes. And moving away from paper-based work processes was a great experience and has changed how I see and approach engineering, validation, and operations. So today I'm going to discuss the following 3 main topics: data, data integrity, and data modeling. The main goal for today is to introduce a new way of looking at documents and data, as well as communicate where we see the industry going from a work process perspective. To achieve this, I will discuss data, metadata, and documents with regards to how we build relationships between data sets and the role documents play in the relationship building. I will also discuss the creation, call it collection maybe, storage and control of data based on data integrity guidelines and regulations. Then I will conclude with data modeling and how we can digitize our work processes to improve our work processes themselves and the data integrity. This presentation is scheduled, I believe, for 45 minutes to an hour. I will do my best to wrap up the main discussion part in about 35 minutes. So that should give us plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation.
Perfect, thank you.
Perfect, yeah, so there's a question, right?
Yeah, so we're just going to launch a poll just to kind of see where everyone is at in their stage of journey to digitalization. So I'm going to launch this poll now and give the audience about 30 seconds or so. So, is it starting today with the presentation? Is it initial discovery, some preparatory work and discussions done? Are you about to launch your first digital validation project? Or maybe you have some projects delivered digitally and considering how to scale them. Or are you actually at the multiple projects across sites are being validated digitally? So I'll just give, like I said, 10 more seconds here to get as many responses as possible so we can kind of get an idea of the audience's placement on this curve. All right, perfect. Most of you have voted now, so I am going to close the poll and share the results. So it's really interesting today. The bulk of you are towards the multiple projects across sites being validated digitally, which I think is great for today's content. So we've got 30% of you in that group, with 14% looking at some projects delivered digitally and looking kind of how to scale them. 12% are about to launch, and then 35% in that initial discovery phase, and 9% starting with today. So welcome to all of you on, no matter where you are on this journey. Either way, you'll find this presentation interesting to talk about looking at some of that digital validation and the quality of data and documents and such together. So Rick, I'll pass it to you to get into it.
Okay, looks like we're back on. Thanks everyone for joining in and giving us some feedback. I think this discussion today will be beneficial to everybody, like Madison said. But if you have gone through this journey and you're pretty far down the pathway, I think this will be a great way to start thinking differently about how you look at your data and look at your documents and really truly get to a digitized solution. So to start off this conversation, let's start at looking at data itself and the metadata around the data and documents from a basic point of view. So here I have three items: data, factual information; metadata, information about the data; and documents, how we consume or create data. To better understand this, I'm going to use a simple example. Richard, Anthony, Minio. These are three pieces of data. Because of cultural norms and understandings, you most likely already figured out that that's my first, middle, and last name, which is the metadata about the data that I just mentioned. Once you add the metadata, you are able to understand what the data is telling you, other than just being three words or pieces of data. If you did not know the metadata, then you would not have understood the data set or what I just told you. Because I read you my bio earlier, you also know that the data in its metadata are linked to the entity you see on your screen. But that's not the full picture, and there is much more data, information, and context that paints the full picture of this entity you're looking at. You can think of data and metadata in table format, a document per se. The data is information in the table cells, and the metadata is the column headers, for example. Data and its metadata can also be entered or consumed in other document formats, such as paragraphs, I'll show you that a little bit later, and test scripts. For example, when I was born, my parents were asked what name did they want to give to the new creature that they see in front of them. So they answered those questions, and that information, the data, was entered into a piece of paper that included other information, other existing data about my parents, the doctor, and the hospital where I was born. That form, the document, combined new data, my data, with existing data, my parents, doctors, and hospital data, and made the relationships between all these data sets. So now the life cycle of my data had begun. So since then, I've collected 50 plus years of data. Not all of it is important, and some of it I might want to forget or to delete. So let's take another look at that idea in a little bit more detail. Here I have the former president of the United States birth certificate. I wasn't going to put mine up there, so I put his. The form and document includes existing information about the hospital and the Brock's parents, just like I mentioned before. And we can think of this data being consumed or viewed because there's existing data. Since Mr. Obama was just born, his data was created on this form. So it is new data, and now the relationship has been made between these data sets. The form that, or the document does the following. It displays existing data for an individual to consume. It was where new data was recorded for the first time. It creates a relationship between multiple data sets. It attributes the data to a person or people that recorded or verified the data. It stores the data for future consumption. This is a paper-based form, so the data and the relationships are not very useful since searching is manual and time-consuming. What if this was an electronic form, a smart document per se? If this was true, existing data would have appeared on the form without data entry from a verified source, most likely and hopefully. New data would have been entered, and along with its metadata, it would have been stored into the database. The relationship between these data sets would have been created and stored as well. This means we would have been able to search a date range and a doctor name to find out how many children did that doctor deliver over that time period. The paper-based form is really a database view used for data entry and data consumption. So this is bringing the document as a data source as opposed to just a document. Just like the table, the form contains fixed headers, metadata, and open cells, data cells. It also contains much more, which I'll touch on later in my presentation. Now let's look at data and metadata more common to the validation world. Here we have 5 sets of unrelated data. From this information, we have information about an asset, a project, a product, design requirements, and a vendor. I did not include all the metadata, but we should be able to figure that out easily, and we assume that the metadata is known. At this stage in the data model, we will assume that the following data is approved, but not verified: the asset, design requirements, and vendor data. We also assume that the product data requirements are approved, verified through clinical studies maybe, and the project data is approved but does not require verification since it's not critical data to our work process and to our data model. So let's look at that data once again, but in a document format, a PQ for this example. As you can see, just like the form, the document brings in data and combines it with predefined text. The paragraph is completed with the data sets from the previous slide. Once this document is created and approved, the unrelated data sets become related. The relationship, just like the data, is approved when the document is pre-approved before it's executed, maybe. In this case, there's a PQ. This means that I can search based on information from any of the data from the 5 data sets. For example, if I want to know which facility COVID vaccine is manufactured, I would be able to get that from the database since the relationship had been made in this document and maybe some others. Let's look at another common document type, the URS. A URS is a combination or collection of requirements data from many sources. Just like the form and the protocol, some of that data is existing, approved in other documents, or some of it is new, created in this document for a new asset, for example. But all these requirements are unverified with regards to the asset it has been developed for. The document creates the relationship between these independent requirements and associates them to an asset. Once the document is approved, we know this is what we want the asset to do, but we do not know if the asset can do it or if it meets our needs. So from this asset lifecycle point of view, this is unverified data. So let's look at what happens with unverified data from the URS. We have selected and purchased an asset that we believe will meet the requirements specified in the URS. But until we test the asset against these requirements, we don't know if it is the right one for our needs. To do this, we create documents, protocols, for example, that contain test scripts that define how to test the asset to ensure it meets our requirements. The test script, just like the scope section, is a combination of text and data, the requirements. In a paper-based system, the requirements are transcribed from the URS to the test script, but in a digital system, the requirements can be linked and displayed as opposed to making new copies, new additions, or new places where the data is stored. Once the test script is executed, the following occurs. The relationship between the URS requirements and the assets are verified. Possibly new ranges are created. New data about that asset is created as verified data. We may have found that our asset can perform better than required, and therefore the actual performance ranges as opposed to design ranges, what we wanted versus what it can do. This process is the same for all asset types, products, equipment, systems, or software. Each step along the asset's lifecycle increases the pooled data and metadata that we have on that asset. Here's a visual example of the data that is collected and stored over an asset's lifecycle, and the documents that either create, display, approve, verify, or store this data and its metadata. All assets start as an idea or a need. I need a sterilizer or to sterilize dry goods, for example. That data starts to take shape, which means that data about this asset starts to be collected or created. As the asset develops over time, more data is generated, and existing data is used in many different documents. After the asset is put into service, data about that asset is still being created and sometimes being modified. As you can see, the documents are at the heart of this asset's data lifecycle. In a paper-based work process, this data can be hard to search and has to be manually mined, therefore it loses much of its value. So now let's turn our attention to data integrity. So I Googled the definition of data and data integrity, and this is what I got. I was shocked to see the definition included factual information and not just information for the definition of data. I have worked with lots of databases, and I don't think I could use the word factual when describing the data in many of them. Data can be hard to manage and maintain in a factual state, specifically when it's usually spread out amongst many systems and located in many places. A majority of the data integrity problems have to do with our data governance and control. How do you control all the data in many different locations, and who is the real master of that data? I will discuss this more in the section of data modeling. This is what the FDA has to say about data integrity. They take factual a little bit further, and they also help us with the scope of our data and what we need to maintain under a data integrity program. This tells us that all data has the same value, not just from a GMP point of view, but from a business point of view as well. So we need to focus on our efforts on the data that means the most to us, or the data that has the greatest impact if it is incorrect. So let's keep that in mind also for the data modeling section as well. Here's a little more nuggets from the FDA. Here the FDA discusses the data's life cycle. In the previous section, I spoke about the asset's life cycle, and similar to the asset life cycle, an individual piece of data has a beginning, time of its creation, a life, and an end. We need to ensure that the data is accurate when it's created, stays accurate throughout its life cycle, lifetime, and is properly disposed of when it's no longer needed. An asset will have many pieces of data throughout its life cycle. Each one deemed critical needs to be controlled and maintained. One last thing on data integrity, the obligatory Alcoa Plus slide. The reason I'm showing this slide is because it demonstrates that there is a lot more about data than data itself. There is a lot of metadata that is needed to fully understand and control the data. So I think back to my example and data in metadata, that was not the whole picture in regards to the data. Information about attribution, contemporaneousness, originality, accuracy also need to be attributed to the data and stored with the data. This is critical to the data modeling and data management. So how can we ensure that data meets data integrity requirements if we don't include all of its metadata to make sure that we know that it is the accurate data and it has been stored and it is retrievable and accurate, and we know who entered it as well. So the last topic I'm going to talk about today is going to be about the data modeling and how we take that data and the metadata and the documents and start to create a model of that data so we can understand how the data is used in our work processes and what data is critical to our work process. So let's look at how we can map the data itself and access so we can assess it and control it. The first thing we need to do is set standards and governance for the data. This means we need to create policies and procedures, identify guidelines or regulatory requirements that are applicable to our data. This governance piece will help us with scoping and assessment of our data. Next, we need to understand our work processes and how that data is created or obtained, as well as how it flows through the work process. For example, if we collect temperature data during sterilization, we need to know that the temperature sensor is in a calibrated state when the measurement was performed. If we do not include that information with our data or a link to it, then we will not be able to ensure our data is accurate. This is critical that we define the scope of the work processes and the data that we are controlling. There is a lot of data that is collected in our systems during the development of our asset and even during its operations, but not all is required to recreate a GMP event, for example. So it's not all critical to our process. How is that data being collected and stored? Is that storage secure? Can it be changed? And what are the rules around updating the data? Assessing the risk if the data was inaccurate or incorrectly changed, as well as putting mitigation tools in to minimize the risk of the data being corrupted. Then finally, we need to define the data model or the work process. This is where we define the life cycle, cradle to grave management of the data, and we need to train individuals on the work process and why this is important to the company and the product. We also need to develop an audit cadence to ensure that we are following our policies and procedures. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next 3 slides. The purpose of these slides is to help guide the data mapping process and assessment. This step is critical and definitely not simple. Getting it right will make the data model much easier to implement and maintain. Here are some questions to help with the assessment of risk. The main focus is around what happens if the data is inaccurate from the beginning or after a change is made. I think this exercise does a couple things for us. It helps us focus our efforts on critical information and also helps us understand our work process a lot better so we can make it more efficient and reduce transcription. For example, we might find that we are transcribing critical data over and over again throughout our work process. This means the data is now located in many places, systems, or documents, and there is no one source of truth. Therefore, if a change is made, if a change to the data is required, the change will be complex since it's needed to be changed in multiple places, and we need to make sure all the data is now properly recorded or changed. And this could be a problem if you have documents out there that have recorded information in it that have been approved, and it was correct at the time of the document's approval. So you won't be able to make the change to that data, which means someone could be picking up the wrong data from an approved document if they don't know where to look to find the actual data or the most recent data that we have. And we can't change approval documents since they are correct when it was approved at the time. So now that we know more about our work processes and we understand our risk, we can implement risk mitigation strategies. And one of the most powerful risk mitigation strategy is to create a single source of truth of critical data that the work process uses. If this can be achieved, then human error would be greatly reduced, and we would be able to control and maintain our data more effectively. Returning back to the idea that the data has its own life cycle, managing the data and
the entryway doorbell.
Sorry. Managing that data and maintain more effectively. And also return back to the idea of data at the life cycle, managing the data, not the documents, is the best way to mitigate risk of inaccurate data. This is what I believe to be the most important reason to transition from a paper-based, document-based work process to a digitized work process that uses documents as vehicles for entering data into storage and retrieving data for consumption, as opposed to storage units for data. I'm reminded of the protocol generation errors that I had to write during changes that occurred to my protocol after my protocol was approved. It definitely wasn't my fault, so I had to have somewhere to blame. The more we can convert the protocols from a rigid scripted document to a smart template based on documents that use controlled data, the more effective, the more efficient and accurate the work processes can be. So let's take a look at what we're thinking at Kneat. Entity management is going to allow us to take in data directly from many sources, pre-document development and during test execution. We can also then use the smart documents to verify that data so we can create a single source of verified truth for many other systems that depend on this data. As we expand this feature, more data can be imported into the Kneat platform, as well as exported out to other systems. This includes data from vendors, service providers, and others, creating an ecosystem of shared information. Having a flexible platform that can consume data from unverified sources, verify that data, store and control that data, and make that data available in many ways and make that available for other systems to consume is a true digital solution. So let's look at this concept in another way. What I'm showing you here is the flow of data through a work process. To keep this from getting too complex, I'm not showing all the data sources and documents in this work process. The data that we create, store, the data that we create, store, and maintain is mainly for assets. An asset can be a product, piece of equipment, or a software program, for example. As we discussed earlier, each asset goes through a life cycle. To demonstrate, let's look at a sterilizer again. The sterilizer starts its data life cycle as a design data requirements, and that could come into our system through other engineering sources and engineering documents that may or may not be part of the Kneat application. The sterilizer is purchased from a vendor as design data, its specifications. Again, that data can be coming directly from the vendor into our work process. The sterilizer is installed and started up. That's project data, and that actually could be some of the documents that we create to test this new asset in its installation. The sterilizer gets tested via test scripts and protocols, operation, maybe performance qualification. Data about this sterilizer is then sent to other systems, such as an ERP system or a calibration system or batch records or whatever is needed for the production of the new product. The sterilizer needs to be tested on a regular basis, so we have requalification, which is adding to this sterilizer's data set and data lifecycle. Changes are made to the sterilizer or the loads of this, that are sterilized within the sterilizer through the change control process, which requires additional testing and again, modifications to the sterilizer and the data set about the sterilizer. And then one day the sterilizer is retired and all that data required to recreate its life cycle or its GMP life cycle will be retired as well. As you can see, the data model is complex and hard to manage since there are many locations that data is stored in many systems, work processes that use that data. The goal of Pharma 4.0 is to move the industry to big data model and remove all paper from our work processes. To do this, we need to fully understand our data and its life cycle, the work process, and change how we think about documents and how we consume the data. If we create work processes where the document is relationship builder and view into the data, the context, then we can build processes that are paper-free and data-driven. To wrap up this discussion, I wanted to discuss templatization of a document and data management coming to Kneat Gx. Entity management, again, I mentioned before, will allow Kneat Gx users to access a large pool of data and use in many document types. This will take Kneat's properties, system, and library, as well as requirements management to a new level. We will be able to create templates that have predefined placeholders that allow data to be shown or entered. We will also be able to bring data on many of the assets and database. We'll make the relationships and connections as we edit the documents we use in the lifecycle, the assets lifecycle. Unlike a database, Kneat Gx is editable and adaptable to meet the needs of the document creator. It doesn't require revalidation when changes are made to the document and the view. So what does that mean for the end user? Flexible data relationships with traceability. We will be able to see all the documents that contain the data, that data or specific data we're looking for. Improved automated requirements trace matrix. Requirements URS data is traceable by relationships made by the documents. A single source of approved verified data that can be used in other systems. And last but not least, the reduction of human error by removing manual administration of data and the document modification. So that concludes my session here. Thank you all for joining, and I think we have some time to answer some of your questions. If not, if we run out of time, I will, I'll try to respond. You can email them to me at rickminio@kneat.com.
So the first question actually is, I think, a good build on the last slide, but essentially it was, how does the Kneat platform relate to the data process and data modeling?
So the Kneat platform actually is a tool for the data processing and data modeling, because by creating documents, we actually create the relationships between unrelated data sets. So when in the background, or I'm sorry, in the foreground, when you look at Kneat, it looks like a document, it feels like a document. But actually what it is building a database in the background that we can't see, per se. And then let's say, go back to that example of the PQ. So by having entity data, and some of this is future state and some of it's today, so I'll try to make sure I clarify that. We are making relationships in the database, but in the future, we want to have this entity management where we can have many entities. An entity could be an asset, could be a product, a piece of equipment, a software. It could be a project. It could be a building. It could be, pretty much a lot of different things, right? It could be anything we have data about. And when we create a document, so we then create the relationship by associating that document to those data sets. And once we associate them, then in the background, the database creates the relationship and builds the model or the data connections. And then we can draw on, if there are existing data sets, we can draw on that data to create our documents, right? So if it's about the asset, we can bring in like the asset number, maybe the make, model, serial number, or whatever that information is that we have in the data set. It could be a project, or it could be the product that we are using for that asset. So all that data will be available for us during the creation of our protocols and our documents, and then approval and or testing to verify that data then solidifies the database to hold all that information and all of its relationships. And it kind of builds a kind of master data versus just consumed data versus the actual source of data. So Kneat is our tool to allow us to create, build the relationships and then store all that data. And then when we view it in our documents, we're actually not creating copies of the data. We're just viewing the data as it is in the database. So you only have one single source of truth. So if changes are made, we see the whole life cycle of that data from the time it's created all the way through when it's retired. And we're always getting the latest information as opposed to information that may be outdated in a document. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm just put a comment actually in the kind of chat function for everyone. If maybe you haven't seen the Kneat Gx platform before, we actually do run demo webinars that show the product, and maybe it will provide a bit of a better understanding if someone hadn't seen it yet. You can register for those or request a demo on our website. All right. The next question here. How do you envision CPPS being pulled into a test document for testing purposes? Will there be a master table of CPPS in Kneat that then the test protocol will pull from?
Yeah, I guess that's probably a fair way of looking at it. Yeah, so that data or that information, we would create, I mean, we're calling it entity management, but I guess entity might be not a full broad term that it would, but basically it is a data set, right? So you create your entity and then you can bring that data set in. So via integration, maybe, depending on the system that the data is coming from. So if we can integrate directly, then you could create the entity and bring in all of its data set from that other system. So that maybe it's an approved data from that other system, or maybe it's not. It depends on where it's coming from and what stage of its life cycle is it in. So the idea then, once we create all those entities, they are tables per se in the database, right? They're an entity with a bunch of data and the metadata about where it came from, when it was created, who created it, all that kind of Alcoa plus information will be with that data. And then the idea is that when you relate, you have many of these data tables, and then the document, you start to relate them together. So then now you're building relationships where data can then be seen in any document, right? So now you create a document and all the data associated with that document. So you say, PQ protocol, for example, and when you create it, you associate it with 5 different entities, for example. Maybe there's an asset, the sterilizer, a project, a building, or location within your facility, product itself, maybe some other, there could be other types of entities that are associated with that document. And once you make that association, all those entities, the data for all those entities is now available for your document. So you can predefine if you already know what you're looking for when you're building your PQ. So you can have predefined, call them data fields in your template. Or if you want to script your protocol and not have it predefined, you would be able to then type in and build your protocol and pull in the data as needed. So it's very flexible. This is where Kneat is very different than a database type solution. With database solutions, the view that you look at the data is usually fixed and programmed. So for example, if I want to take a standard database and create protocols from that, I would have to build views for people to either enter data and or see their data, but that view would be a more of a programmed solution, right? You'd have to build the actual view, you'd have to put the cells in, and you wouldn't be able to free text or change. Where Kneat is unique, so I can, if we're allowed to be able to actually type in and change our view. We can add whatever we want. We can add more information, either textual or smart information, or create new scripts or places to enter data. So hopefully that answered your question. I think that, so data coming in from other systems via integration or manually entering into the entity, that creates a table, and then that data is available for all documents within your Kneat system.
Thanks, Rick. Their next question is, can the database trace software requirements and test scripts populate and auto-populate the traceability matrix?
Yeah, so we can do that now. So we do have a requirements management feature. This is where the requirements are uniquely identified in the URS or whatever other document that you want to trace to. And in your test scripts, you end up, the way we do it is we have a table where we can link that test script to that requirement. So we do a cross-referencing. So in that sense, we are automatically building the cross-references and the traceability matrix. In the future, it's going to be a little different, but similar. The difference is going to be the fact that it's more entity-driven as opposed to document-driven. So today, these requirements or data pieces are in a URS and they're numbered in the URS. And other documents could change the data, right? So you don't have like a master data that is controlled outside of the documents. So in the future, entity management will allow for the data to be controlled and have hierarchy on permissions on what can change that actual data. So if you want to change your requirement in the future, you actually you have to change the data itself and not just the document. So which allows us to have better control over that that entity, or the data within that entity. So that requirement has a beginning, the first time it was approved, and then change number 1, change number 2, and that way we can trace it as well, not just individually for a given document or a given time period, but we can see that requirement as it's going through its life cycle and all that it's been traced to in other documents such as test scripts and so forth. So it's going to give us even more capabilities than we currently have today for automatic traceability matrix creation. Okay.
Thank you. Is Kneat validated to meet COA Plus requirements?
The Kneat, the platform itself?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. It's a validated software. It's Parliament compliant. It's data integrity. We do validate the software itself. So when we have new customers, when they purchase the software is validated, and they get all that documentation proving it's validated software. And then obviously they can do their own testing, specifically if they want to meet GAMP requirements or CSV or CSA requirements that are outside of what we do. But we do provide all the documentation for compliance, including data integrity.
Wonderful. Questions here around interfacing with other systems.
Mm-hmm.
So, ERP, document management, billing systems. Would you be able to speak to that?
I'll do my best. So we do have API that can do integration. We are building more capability on API over time. So it is available. What's the biggest, maybe call it the hurdle or the thing that needs to happen, is the actual integration piece. So there's a lot of systems out there. What systems are being integrated that we're integrating to? So that is more of a customer by customer decision, and we are looking at building some integration with the more popular systems like Jira, like maybe a Viva document management system or something like that. But in the meantime, we have the capability, but the integrations would have to be built to share either in bringing in the data or pushing the data out, depending on how you want to integrate and what system you want to integrate with. But capability is there. It's the integration piece that is needed. It's more like a data lake idea, and sharing that information just needs to be mapped to the other system.
Perfect. And yeah, that's continue to get better over time.
Correct. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions here, kind of similar, but it's like about linking to external data tables, or can we import data? Does the user need to create new tables? Like, how does that part work?
So we are taking the approach of more of like a data lake kind of approach, so that data and the data tables would be available. So again, going back to data versus metadata, those tables contain both. So how do we share across, and what needs to be shared can be determined. But a lot of the tables are actually created automatically within Kneat. So as you're creating your documents, you're actually creating data tables in the background. So that's one of the neat things about Kneat. It's not we have to create the tables and then fill the tables with data. Now, the entity management is an idea of, that is a little different, because that is a data set that would require either manual input of data or bringing data from another source, like for example, an asset. You have a lot of information about that asset. You could bring that in from your engineering tools, maybe during a large project. A lot of these engineering companies and the construction companies keep a database of all the assets with a lot of metadata, maybe 30 some bits of data per asset. That could be then brought directly in to create these entities. We're currently doing a lot of this through our folders, and this will allow us to get away from the folder being the entity or that placeholder, and gives our documents more freedom, so we can just bring in the data and then relate the document to the entity, as opposed to fixing the document to a folder, for example. So yeah, absolutely bringing in data from other sources, and then when we are done validating and our verification of our, so maybe our model number for our sterilizer is unverified until we validate it. And now once we're done validating, we know that that's the correct model number, and that could be then shared through a data table or a data set to another system. Okay.
Is there change control around the values in the entity management tables?
I'm gonna have to answer that question, yes, but it's not fully baked at the moment, but that is the idea. So in our current model, with data can be changed in a sense, and it gets approved in any document, where in the data entity or entity management will allow us to manage the data itself. So this way, when the data is created, it gets its it has its metadata, whatever it is, maybe asset ID, for example. But what are the rules around changing that, and what is the hierarchy and requirements to change it? So, for example, if somebody did want to change the model or something about that data set, it's not just putting it into a document, changing it, and then approving that document. You'd actually have to go to the document that controls that data. So you do have to understand where the data is created and what document owns that data, or what system owns that data. So that way, when we make the change, we can ensure that the right review and approval happens. So that data is just not changed by accident or by someone who's not authorized to make that change. And even if the change is made, we would have the history of what it was, what it is now after the change, who made the change, when the change was made. So all the Alcoa data or metadata about that requirement or data piece will be held in Kneat. So you can see the life cycle of that data. So we are putting in more strict controls around data and how it can be changed and or modified. I'm talking about presentation, I talked about the control of data, and that's really what we're going for, is controlling the data and not the documents themselves. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Do you see Kneat as a consumer or producer of data?
The answer is yes, it's both. So Kneat will consume data. So it consumes data through maybe like the engineering design requirements coming into Kneat. That's what I would consider consumption of data, but also consumes data for the testing. So if we run that sterilizer and we send off our samples or biologic indicators to QC, and in LIMS, they produce results and show that either we got kill or not, then we can consume that data as evidence that the the process worked. We consume data from calibration, from all the other parts, right? In our validation as part of our record to show that we have tested the system and it meets the requirements. So anything from screenshots to whatever, that's all, in my mind, consumption of data, bringing it into Kneat to build that record. But then at the end, we actually create a final record. So there could be new information created. So we create data about the testing, right? When we do the testing, there is information being entered for the first time. So there's data being created in Kneat. And that becomes, obviously, the storing of that data is important. So we do both. We take in data from other sources, and during the use of Kneat, we create data. And some of that data is created manually by adding it, by a person executing a protocol, for example, or writing a document and creating those relationships, as well as automatically when relationships are made and things and processes, when we're going through our process, data is being created by Kneat, recording, audit trail information, and other things to support our Alcoa requirements. So yeah, it does both in a sense, but I definitely see Kneat as becoming a source of truth and a place to go to control your data, because I think that's one thing I've always found is missing in our I'm calling it industry, or we tend to rely on many sources of data, and sometimes the data isn't always reconciled, and it could lead to confusion on what's the correct data and where should we be getting the source of data, especially on large projects. We don't always see, there's a lot of things changing, and how do you know what data you're pulling and is it the right data? Kind of saying it's kind of like, oh, that's so yesterday information, right? So always changing, always adapting. Who owns that data? What's the master source of that data? And how do we control that data? And I think that's where we're trying to accomplish at Kneat. And I think the data entity management is a major step towards a single source of truth.
Very true. There's one last question. It is a little specific, so I'm going to send it to you in Teams. I'll read it out loud, and if we need to follow up specifically with this person, we can. But essentially, it's in automation, particularly in the context of a DCS process control software. There are often many software objects, classes, instances, modules, graphics. Assuming these each should the entities. In this shift to entity-driven, where would an entity list live in relation to the traditional lifecycle of project documents? And is there another lifecycle doc that should contain this information within Kneat?
That's a good question. So
Yeah.
So each of those are entities, right? I mean, they can be entities, and there are sub-entities, right? In a sense, right? They're related entities, which we would relate through documents. So Kneat in itself could be. I mean, I guess depends on your work process and where you want to store the information. Could be that source of that entity kind of life cycle and or hierarchy as well. So I think especially Delta V, you have like your recipe level, you have your all the way down to your equipment level type software. But each of those, in a sense, are a piece of or entity on their own, but they're all related, right? But they're related through the system itself, right? So you might have an entity like a bioreactor, for example, and you have recipes, you have unit ops, you have equipment modules, all the different parts of your Delta V. And when you do your validation, you're creating a connection between all those data sets. So in a way, it is being built for you when you build your protocols, because you are saying that this document is associated with the Delta V and these subsystems or I don't call them subsystems, subprograms or configurations of the Delta V program. So again, I think this goes back to understanding your work process. Not everybody does things exactly the same way, and finding out the best way to control your data and where to put your data is up to you. And but we're just trying to give you tools and options to help you manage your data in a different way. So hopefully that answered your question. I was very specific. So I think I understood what was being asked. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was from a partner organization. So if we need to talk about it later, we definitely can. So thank you.
If I didn't answer your question properly,
yeah. Perfect. Well, Rick, thank you for being in the hot seat. That was a good list of questions, and thank you everyone for your participation. As mentioned at the top of this webinar, it is recorded, so you will get an email later this week that will have the recording as well as the slides. So stay tuned for that. And also mentioned in the comments earlier, our next webinar is taking place on January 31st and will be a demo of the software. So feel free to register on that link I shared earlier. And with that, thank you again, everyone, for participating. Rick, thank you for developing this content and sharing it. And we hope to see you on the next Kneat webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.